Hey everyone, Bill Harris here, and wow, do I have a story for you today. The United States just seized another oil tanker off Venezuela's coast, and I've been going through these reports all morning because this one is fundamentally different from what we've seen before. We're talking military helicopters, Coast Guard boarding teams, $130 million worth of oil now in U.S. hands. But here's what got me out of my chair. This ship wasn't even sanctioned. I'll explain why that matters in a second. Venezuela's calling it piracy, Brazil's warning about catastrophe, and Trump is literally on record saying Venezuela stole American oil and he wants it back. So look, I'm going to break down what actually happened here, share my thoughts on why this concerns me, and tell you where I think this is heading. Let's jump into it. Okay, so let me walk you through what went down on Saturday morning, December 20th, because the details here matter. Pre-dawn operation. The Coast Guard, backed up by the Pentagon, intercepts this Panama flag tanker called the Centuries in international waters east of Barbados. Now let me show you what the articles are reporting on this. So from CNN, we have a headline that says the U.S. seizes another vessel off Venezuela's coast. And The Guardian says U.S. intercepts second merchant vessel off coast of Venezuela in international waters. So Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem actually posted a 7-minute video of the operation. I watched the whole thing this morning, and honestly, it looks like something out of a Jason Bourne movie. Military helicopters hovering over the water, armed personnel rappelling down onto the vessel. This is not your typical customs inspection, folks. The cargo, 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude oil headed to China. We're talking about $130 to $140 million at current oil prices. But here's what really caught my attention, and this is where it gets interesting. The ship's tracking system was lying about its location. The automatic identification system showed it sailing toward the Caribbean. But when you look at the satellite imagery, the ship had actually been sitting off Venezuela's coast since at least December 4th. This is what intelligence analysts call shadow fleet tactics. These vessels literally spoof their GPS data to hide where they've really been. It's pretty sophisticated stuff, and it shows you the lengths these operations go to. Now, here's the legal bombshell that I need you to understand, and this is what separates this from the first seizure. This vessel was not on the sanctions list. The first ship they seized 10 days ago, the Skipper, that one was sanctioned, had alleged ties to Iran and Hezbollah. Clear legal justification for that seizure, but the Centuries, not sanctioned. And that changes everything from a legal perspective. Let me read you what this sanctions law expert Jeremy Panner said, because he knows what he's talking about. The seizure of a vessel that is not sanctioned by the U.S. marks a further increase in Trump's pressure on Venezuela. It also runs counter to Trump's statement that the U.S. would impose a blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers. So even Trump himself said he'd only blockade sanctioned tankers. But now they're going after non-sanctioned ones. That's a massive expansion of what they publicly committed to doing, and frankly, I think that's a problem. The U.S. argument seems to be, even though the ship itself isn't sanctioned, it was carrying oil from a sanctioned source and using deceptive practices. But I'll be honest with you, that's a way broader interpretation of enforcement authority than we've seen in decades of sanctions policy. Here's what Secretary Noem said about the operation, and I want you to pay attention to the language she's using. That the United States will continue to pursue the illicit movement of sanctioned oil that is used to fund narco-terrorism in the region. We will find you, and we will stop you. We will find you, and we will stop you. Look, that's not diplomatic language. That's not even typical government spokesperson language. That's a direct threat, and it sounds more like something you'd hear from a mob boss than a cabinet secretary. And notice how she frames this entire thing as fighting narco-terrorism, not just enforcing economic sanctions. That framing matters because it justifies more aggressive military action in the public's mind. All right, so I know what you're thinking. Bill, how the hell did we get to this point? Because this escalation has been happening really fast, and I want to give you the full timeline so you understand the progression. December 10th, U.S. seizes the first tanker, the Skipper. That one was already sanctioned, allegedly had ties to Iran's Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah. From a legal standpoint, that one made sense to me. You sanction a vessel, you enforce it. Then December 17th, Trump issues an executive order declaring a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going in and out of Venezuela. Now, I need to stop here because that word blockade should make your ears perk up. In international law, a naval blockade is traditionally considered an act of war. I'm not being hyperbolic here. This is what the Union did to the Confederacy during the Civil War. This is what Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis when we were on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Blockades are serious business, and you don't just casually declare one against another country unless you're prepared for the consequences. And now here we are on December 20th with the seizure of a non-sanctioned vessel. So clearly this blockade is expanding way beyond what was initially announced, and that concerns me. But look, the tanker seizures are just one piece of what's happening down there. The U.S. has massively ramped up military presence in the Caribbean. We're talking more warships, more Coast Guard cutters, more surveillance flights. This is a real military buildup, and it's happening right in our hemisphere. And here's the part that genuinely worries me. The Trump administration has conducted over 24 military strikes on vessels near Venezuela. They claim these are drug trafficking boats. These strikes have reportedly killed at least 100 people. Let me read you what the reports are saying about these strikes, because this is important. The strikes are widely considered illegal under both U.S. and international law and have been described as extrajudicial killings by legal scholars and rights groups. So legal experts, people who study international law for a living, are calling these extrajudicial killings. Think about what that means for a second. The U.S. military is destroying boats and killing everyone on board based on intelligence that they're drug traffickers, but without any arrest, without any trial, without even attempting to capture these people alive. Now look, I'm no fan of drug traffickers. Nobody is. But we're supposed to be a nation of laws. We're supposed to believe in due process. And what we're doing here is summary execution based on intelligence that we're not even showing anyone. That should concern you regardless of your political affiliation. Trump has also hinted that land strikes on Venezuelan territory could be next. He hasn't done it yet. But the fact that a U.S. president is openly discussing potential military strikes against a neighboring country tells you where his head's at. So I had to ask myself, why is Trump doing all this? What's the actual motivation here? And when reporters asked him that same question, here's what he said. We're not going to be letting anybody going through who shouldn't be going through. You remember, they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil not that long ago, and we want it back. They took it. They illegally took it. They took our oil and we want it back. I mean, he's not even trying to hide it. He's talking about Venezuela's nationalization of their oil industry back in the 1970s and again under Hugo Chavez and Maduro. American companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips had major operations there. When Venezuela nationalized, these companies won billions in arbitration awards. Venezuela paid some, but not all of it. But here's my issue with Trump's framing. It wasn't our oil. It was Venezuela's oil in Venezuela's ground, and they made a sovereign decision to nationalize their natural resources. You can disagree with that policy. You can say it was economically stupid, but calling it theft, that's a stretch. And honestly, I think this goes way deeper than just debt collection. The scale of this military operation, the aggressive rhetoric, the willingness to violate international norms, this looks like regime change to me. I think the goal is to get rid of Maduro entirely. So how is Venezuela responding to all this? Well, they're not exactly being subtle about it. The Venezuelan government is calling this international piracy, and Vice President Delcy Rodriguez issued a statement that I think you need to hear in full because the language here is significant. Venezuela denounces and rejects the theft and hijacking of a new private vessel transporting oil, as well as the forced disappearance of its crew, committed by military personnel of the United States of America in international waters. Forced disappearance of its crew. Now, that's serious human rights language. When governments talk about forced disappearances, they're talking about state actors kidnapping people and then denying they have them. It's one of the most serious human rights violations you can commit. We don't know the exact status of the crew yet, but Venezuela is clearly trying to frame this as both theft and kidnapping. And you know what? Given that we seized a ship in international waters and took its crew, they're not entirely wrong to frame it that way. But Rodriguez didn't just condemn it, she made threats. These acts will not go unpunished. Venezuela will take all corresponding actions, including filing a complaint before the United Nations Security Council, other multilateral organizations, and the governments of the world. So they're going to the UN Security Council. Now look, I'm a realist. This isn't going to accomplish much because the U.S. can veto any resolution condemning our actions. But it does put us on the defensive internationally, and it gives Russia and China a platform to criticize U.S. policy and look like the reasonable ones. The immediate economic impact on Venezuela is brutal, and this is where the humanitarian concern comes in. Since that first seizure on December 10th, multiple tankers loaded with Venezuelan oil are just sitting in Venezuelan waters. They're too scared to leave because they might get seized too. According to what I've been reading in the maritime trade publications, there are at least 5 large tankers stuck there right now. That's roughly 10 million barrels of oil, around $700 to $800 million that Venezuela can't access. The threat alone is creating an effective embargo. And here's the thing. Venezuela's already in economic collapse. Hyperinflation, food shortages, millions of people have already fled the country. Oil exports are basically their only source of foreign currency. Without that money, they can't import food, medicine, basic necessities. So when we cut off their oil exports, we're not just hurting Maduro. We're hurting ordinary Venezuelan people who are already suffering. And I think we need to be honest about that trade-off. Maduro is obviously framing this as American imperialism, trying to steal Venezuela's oil. And honestly, given what Trump literally said about wanting our oil back, that narrative isn't hard to sell, especially in Latin America, where people remember the long history of U.S. intervention. Now, I want to talk about how other countries are reacting, because this is where I think it gets really interesting and where we should be paying attention. Brazil's President Lula is not mincing words here. At a South American summit, he issued this direct warning to Trump. An armed intervention in Venezuela would be a humanitarian catastrophe. And you know what? He's right. A U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would be an absolute disaster. We're talking millions of refugees, tens of thousands of casualties, decades of instability. Anyone who thinks this would be quick and easy hasn't been paying attention to our recent military adventures. But Lula didn't stop there. He made this historical comparison that I think is really powerful. The South American continent is once again haunted by the military presence of an extra-regional power, referencing the Falklands War. So he's comparing this to the Falklands War between Argentina and the UK back in 1982. That was the last time a foreign military power fought in South America. And look, I get why Lula is making this comparison. Latin America has this really painful history with US military intervention. Guatemala in '54, Chile in '73, Nicaragua in the '80s, Panama in '89, and that's just the ones we know about. Throughout the 20th century, we repeatedly intervened in Latin American countries, usually to protect American business interests or install friendly governments. So when Lula talks about an extra-regional power, he's activating this deep historical memory about imperialism. And his voice matters because Brazil is South America's biggest economy and most important country. Now, I want to be clear about my own view here. I think Lula's concerns are legitimate. We should be listening to what our neighbors are saying instead of just dismissing them. Other countries are expressing concern too. Colombia is calling for dialogue. Mexico is sticking to their traditional policy of non-intervention. Even Argentina's right-wing president, who generally likes Trump, hasn't explicitly endorsed military action because he knows it would be political suicide domestically. Now let's talk about the bigger players, because this is where it gets geopolitically complicated. China is Venezuela's biggest oil customer, importing about 400,000 to 500,000 barrels per day. That's 4% of China's total oil imports. They've also lent Venezuela billions of dollars that's secured by future oil shipments. China has condemned the seizures, but their response has been pretty measured. They oppose it rhetorically, but I'm not convinced they're willing to risk their own tankers being seized or escalating with the U.S. over Venezuela. Russia has been more vocal. Putin called this aggression and illegal under international law. Russia has military advisors in Venezuela. They've sold them weapons, and they use Venezuela as a counterbalance to U.S. influence in Latin America. But here's the thing. Russia's completely tied down in Ukraine right now. They're burning through equipment and personnel, so I don't know how much they can actually help Venezuela, even if they wanted to. I found this analysis from a former U.S. diplomat that I think is pretty spot on. The Trump administration seems to be signaling regime change. It's difficult to see if that's exactly the objective, but all of these are just different means of the same objective of trying to put pressure on the Maduro government. So even the experts who worked in government aren't totally sure what the end game is. Is it regime change? Is it forcing Maduro to negotiate? Is it completely cutting off oil exports? There's genuine ambiguity about the strategic objective here, and that ambiguity worries me. All right, I want to talk about the legal side of this because I think it's actually the most important part that people are missing. So normally, economic sanctions work through, well, economic pressure. You designate certain entities as sanctioned, and it becomes illegal for U.S. persons and companies to do business with them. Foreign companies that violate sanctions risk losing access to U.S. markets and the dollar financial system. That's powerful leverage, but it's economic leverage. What we're seeing now is fundamentally different. This is military force being used to enforce economic policy. And I think we need to be really careful about that distinction. Here's the key legal question that I've been wrestling with. Can the U.S. legally seize a non-sanctioned vessel in international waters just because it's carrying oil from a sanctioned country? Under international maritime law, specifically the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, there's supposed to be freedom of navigation on the high seas. Countries can only interfere with other countries' vessels in very limited circumstances. Piracy, slave trading, or if the vessel has no nationality. The U.S. is arguing that these vessels are engaged in sanctions evasion, which somehow justifies seizing them. But whether sanctions evasion alone is grounds for military seizure under international law, that's heavily disputed, and frankly, I don't think we have the legal authority to do this. There's also the UN Charter, Article 2.4, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Using military force to seize vessels in international waters seems like it could violate that pretty clearly. And then there's the whole blockade issue that I mentioned earlier. Trump declared a blockade, which in traditional international law is an act of war. You can't just blockade another country in peacetime. That's not how the international system is supposed to work. Now, the administration will say these are legitimate counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism operations, not acts of war. They'll point to the shadow fleet tactics, the alleged links to drug trafficking and terrorism, and argue they have the authority to enforce their sanctions however they see fit. But here's my problem with that. A lot of legal scholars, people who specialize in international law, are saying this crosses lines that shouldn't be crossed, and I tend to agree with them. And here's what really worries me about the precedent this sets. If the United States can seize any vessel carrying oil from a country we've sanctioned, what stops China from doing the same thing? What stops Russia? What stops any country with a big enough navy from deciding they can just grab ships they don't like? This could undermine the entire system of international maritime law that global trade depends on. And that's not in America's long-term interests, even if it might serve our short-term goals in Venezuela. So, let me talk about where I think this is heading, because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I want to share my honest assessment. Scenario 1, continued escalation. Trump keeps seizing vessels, maybe escalates to actual military strikes on Venezuelan territory. Venezuela's oil exports completely collapse. The Maduro government faces total economic disaster. This could lead to regime change through a military coup, popular uprising, or negotiated transition. But here's what worries me about this scenario. It could also create an absolutely massive humanitarian catastrophe. We're talking potentially millions more Venezuelans fleeing to neighboring countries and to the United States. We're talking mass starvation, complete economic collapse, possible civil war, and then we own that mess. Scenario 2, Venezuela finds workarounds. They route oil through other countries, use even more sophisticated evasion tactics, get help from China and Russia to keep some exports flowing. This becomes a long-term game of cat and mouse like what we've seen with Iran and North Korea. Scenario 3, and this is the nightmare, military escalation. Venezuela or one of its allies tries to break the blockade by force. Maybe a Venezuelan patrol boat confronts a U.S. warship and someone fires first. Or Trump follows through on his hints about land strikes. This could turn into an actual shooting war. And let me be clear about my view on that. A war with Venezuela would be catastrophic and completely unjustified. We'd be invading a country that hasn't attacked us over oil and debt collection. That's not what America should be doing. Scenario 4, negotiated settlement. Under massive pressure and facing economic collapse, Maduro agrees to negotiate. Maybe Venezuela pays the arbitration awards owed to U.S. companies. Maybe there's some kind of power-sharing arrangement with the opposition. Maybe there's a deal that allows limited oil exports under monitoring. But honestly, this seems like the least likely scenario to me because both sides are so dug in. Trump sees Maduro as a dictator who stole American assets. Maduro sees Trump as an imperialist trying to steal Venezuela's sovereignty. There's not a lot of room for compromise there. My gut feeling, and I could be wrong about this, is that we're heading for some combination of scenarios 1 and 2. Continued pressure, significant reduction in Venezuelan oil exports, Maduro finding some workarounds with help from China and Russia, and a grinding long-term standoff that could last years. The risk of actual war is real, but I think it's lower than it might seem for one simple reason. Neither side actually wants a shooting war. Venezuela's military can't compete with the U.S. military. They know that. And I don't think Trump actually wants to invade and occupy Venezuela despite his rhetoric, because the political and economic costs would be enormous. But here's the thing about military confrontations. Miscalculation happens. Accidents happen. Someone misinterprets someone else's intentions, someone panics, and suddenly you're in a conflict nobody actually wanted. There's also the bigger question that I think we're not talking about enough. What does this mean for U.S. policy in Latin America going forward? Are we going back to the era of interventionism? Are we going to see other Latin American countries move closer to China and Russia as a counterbalance to what they see as U.S. aggression? Because I'll tell you, if I were a Latin American leader watching this unfold, I'd be thinking real hard about diversifying my security partnerships. All right, let me bring this all home for you. The United States just seized its second Venezuelan oil tanker in 10 days. Unlike the first one, this vessel wasn't even sanctioned, which represents a major expansion of enforcement tactics and, in my opinion, a concerning expansion of executive power. This is all part of Trump's declared total and complete blockade of Venezuela, backed by a significant military buildup in the Caribbean and repeated military strikes that legal experts are calling extrajudicial killings. Venezuela is calling it piracy and going to the UN Security Council. They're facing an effective embargo as other vessels are too scared to leave Venezuelan waters for fear of seizure. The humanitarian impact is already severe and will likely get worse. Brazil's Lula is warning about the dangers of intervention and making historical comparisons to past foreign military actions in South America. Other regional leaders are expressing similar concerns. China and Russia oppose what we're doing, though their ability or willingness to actually help Venezuela is unclear. The legal basis for seizing non-sanctioned vessels in international waters is dubious at best. Many international law experts think we're violating the UN Charter and maritime law, and I think the precedent this sets is dangerous for the international order. Trump's own words suggest this is partly about recovering assets from U.S. oil companies. But the scale of military operations tells me the real goal is regime change. Now, here's my take, and you can disagree with me in the comments. I think this is a dangerous escalation that's not in America's long-term interests. I'm no fan of Maduro. The guy's a dictator who's run his country into the ground. But using military force to seize ships in international waters, conducting strikes that kill hundreds of people without trial, and openly discussing invasion, that's not who we should be as a country. We're supposed to believe in international law. We're supposed to believe in due process. We're supposed to be better than just taking what we want because we have the biggest military. And practically speaking, this could blow up in our face. We could end up with millions of refugees, a failed state on our doorstep, and a region that's more hostile to U.S. influence than ever before. I think there were better ways to pressure Maduro. I think we could have worked with regional partners. I think we could have used diplomatic and economic tools without resorting to what looks an awful lot like acts of war. But that's not the path we chose. And now we're going to have to live with the consequences. This story is going to keep developing. More seizures are coming. The situation will escalate. And I'll be here covering it, giving you the facts and my honest analysis. If you appreciate this kind of in-depth coverage, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Share this video with people who need to understand what's happening, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with my take? Do you think Trump's justified? Do you think I'm being too critical? I genuinely want to hear from you. This is Bill Harris, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay informed, stay critical, and don't let anyone tell you what to think.